Hello, lovelies. Auntie's so thrilled to introduce my next visitor, a very talented narrator with a soft-spoken manner who tells the most unsettling stories. Please welcome Immunity Zero. Follow those links, my dears, and show him that creepy love. You can also hear him and Auntie on SCRM radio. That's Scream Radio. I just so happen to have a link for that as well. Check out both our shows, lovelies, as well as the others. There's some really scary talent over there. But for now, settle in, get comfy, and listen to our tale. What I Found in the Ashland Police Department's Evidence Locker. The Worst Thing, by Professional Succubus. In my senior year of college, this would have been in '93, my degree required an internship. Luckily, the local police department had a friendly relationship with the criminal justice faculty at my school. It was easy for me to nab a position in my fall semester, and most of the cops seemed like they enjoyed showcasing their expertise to a newbie. I enjoyed a couple weeks of ride-alongs and tours of the headquarters, but soon I felt like I'd gotten the gist of it, to be honest. This was a college town in rural Illinois, so it was basically drunk kids, meth cooks, meth users, and traffic tickets. Sprinkle on some bar fights, shoplifting, and domestic violence, and you had Ashland figured out. My internship was made even better by my cousin Frank, an Ashland cop, who saw to it that I wasn't bored. He would show me which parts of town to avoid, tell me some of his war stories, and once when we were patrolling late at night, he sped down a stretch of road while blasting the theme song from Cops. It's been long enough, so I'm not worried about getting myself or Frank in trouble now. He left the force in 2007 and has been working happily in private security ever since. I ended up staying on the academic track and am similarly unconcerned about getting in trouble for something I did over 2 decades ago. The thing I shouldn't have done was photocopy police evidence without permission and keep it. I still have the copies, one letter and some journal pages, sitting right next to me as I type this. I had forgotten about it until I read my email this morning and saw a message from Frank. Then I went to the basement where I kept all the nostalgic junk from my adolescence and early adulthood and started digging through boxes. I can't explain why I kept those pages for so long. The shock value alone is probably a sufficient enough explanation. But there was something else, some sentimentality or something. The woman who wrote them is gone and has no family, and some part of me hated the thought of her existence winking out of memory like a dying star. The night I copied the evidence was a Friday. I was scheduled to be at the police department from 4 p.m. to midnight. Frank was working, so he scooped me up and we set out in his squad car. A couple speeding tickets, a wellness check, and 1 sub sandwich later, the sun was setting. Frank turned around in a cul-de-sac to begin patrolling his sector again. Navigating the winding neighborhoods, he slowed as we passed 1 block.
"Has anyone told you about the murder that happened over here?"
he said with dramatic intonation. My interest was piqued. In 3 weeks of shadowing, one noticeably absent part of this internship was the regaling of famous local crimes. Tempted by the prospect of an eerie tale to usher in the fall evening, I told him I hadn't. Frank pointed to one of the homes, a small farmhouse with a wraparound porch. Its white paint was peeling, and although it looked small, It had a second story with a large balcony.
So, in the 80s, a lady named Alice Weiss lived in that house. A guy named Colton lived over there.
He pointed to the powder blue house next door. It was in better shape than the White House, but it still looked pretty run down. The vinyl siding was dirty. Unkempt vines choked the porch's lattice work. Unlike the rest of the homes in the neighborhood, this one still had a gravel driveway peppered with tufts of weeds.
Then around Thanksgiving, cops get a call about gunshots coming from the Colton house. They show up and find Weiss on his front porch with her brains blown out, and Colton inside in the same condition. What got people extra riled up is that Weiss had pentagram-shaped burns on both of her arms. Coroner said they were a decade old, at least. Colton's body had pentagrams carved into his skin too, but they were fresh. It looked like Weiss did it before she killed him.
Well, this was right in the middle of all the 80s satanic panic, right? I said, secretly hoping Frank would think I was knowledgeable.
Right.
He said absently.
But that bullshit cropped up all across the country, and there are plenty of alleged cases without any real evidence to back up the accusations. Here, we had a case with flesh and blood victims, one of which had satanic markings on her body predating that whole fiasco.
Fair enough, I replied. Frank made a right at the stop sign and continued through the neighborhood.
That's the end of the story, unfortunately. Weiss had been mentally ill for most of her life, and people were exactly as understanding as you'd think. Everybody assumed she was just a crazy woman who worshipped the devil, because that's what crazy people do. And when that wasn't enough, she murdered her neighbor.
I mulled over his words as a silence overtook the cruiser. Frank broke the quiet a few minutes later when we emerged out on the main road.
And as much as people tried to forget it happened, the Weiss case just stuck with people. Colton had been her neighbor since she was born, known her family, known her grandparents. They lived next to each other for over 30 years, and then one day out of the blue, she just murders him and offs herself?
A tinny voice on Frank's walkie interrupted him. Dispatch needed an officer to come back to the station and help with an emergency ex parte order. When we got there, a distraught woman with a black eye was sitting in the lobby, rapidly tapping her foot against the tiles. Frank gave me a knowing look and told me to go find Sergeant Tate. He would come get me when he was done writing the report. The Ashland Police Department was clearing out old files to be moved to off-site storage, and today it was Sergeant Tate's problem. I helped him move box after box, looking longingly at some of the files. After 30 minutes, the sergeant told me in a low voice he was going out back for a smoke. On his way out, he called out over his shoulder in a teasing voice, "No peeking now," offering him an empty promise not to. I stood obediently until I heard the door shut behind him. Then I went to work. I rifled through every box, content to read a little here and there, but at the front of my mind was the story Frank had told me less than an hour before. After a few minutes of unstacking boxes and hectic shuffling, I hadn't found any files from before 1979. The excitement I'd felt gave way to resignation. I wouldn't be finding anything on Alice Weiss in here. Nevertheless, I continued to look through the old files, though at a slower pace. There was still a chance I might find something. Plus, I reasoned that I might as well look while I had the time. My instincts ended up proving correct. My heart rate quickened once I started to see dates from 1980, then 1981. I kept going until, in a box of files from 1984, I saw it. One manila folder bore the label 010-11785-009, Weiss House. I glanced around and pulled it out of the box. The folder contained only a letter and a small journal, both bagged. Automatically, I threw it back in the box and carried the whole thing to the adjacent corner, where there was a small desk, a file cabinet, and a copier. I peered out the door frame, saw nothing, heard nothing. I cracked the photocopier cover and slid the letter still in its plastic underneath and hit start. The machine came to life and I whirled around and started to loudly restack some of the boxes. I knew Sergeant Tate smoked American spirits, so I had a comfortable 8 to 10 minutes before he returned, and I'd used at least 5 searching the boxes. The second the copier had finished, I put away the letter, maneuvered the journal open, and began on the first few pages of that. I had never felt so tense, and the compulsion to duplicate those documents was not one I could explain. I had started, and I barreled on to finish, feeling dread at both the potential for trouble and the prospect of not succeeding. When the final page came out, I returned the journal to its box, folded up the papers, and shoved them into my small purse. Then, since I didn't hear Sergeant Tate, I decided to rearrange some of the boxes to hide my unexplainably desperate search. By the time he returned, smelling faintly of smoke and humming tunelessly, I had calmed down and resumed my normal work. I finished my shift, intensely aware of the paper crammed in my bag. When I got back to my apartment, it was blissfully empty, the remnants of my roommate's pre-party lying scattered around our living room. Hesitant to look at my spoils, I changed into pajamas and reheated some leftovers. I eyed my purse as I ate. Once the food was gone, I retrieved the wad of paper. The evidence tag was blurry, but legible on the page beneath the writing. Dated 11/17/85, it referenced a case number and listed case type as homicide, suicide. I read the one-page letter first. It was written on lined notebook paper in confident, swooping cursive. I'm transcribing it below. My name is Alice Weiss. I'm 33. I still live in the house I was raised in, 3106 Birch Lane. I have been in and out of psychiatric care for over half of my life. Recently, my therapist and I have been doing some new things to try and get at some of my problems. Among other things, I've been having nightmares on and off for the past 15 or 16 years. I can't glean anything useful from them, just an unhelpful combination of darkness, candlelight, fear, pain, screaming, nausea. So, after failed attempts at everything from cognitive behavioral therapies to medication and dietary changes, she's asked me to keep a dream diary. If I commit to writing down anything and everything I remember, she says I may understand a little more about what is actually happening in my dreams. The last few weeks, I've been writing down what I remember when the dreams wake me up in the middle of the night. I didn't read any of the entries until earlier today. I was afraid of how it would all sound in the daylight. It worked, but I don't think this is what my therapist meant to happen. I remember where the burns came from. It wasn't something I did to myself like Mama told Dr. Colton. I remember everything now, and I'm going to kill that son of a bitch. The second item was a black notebook, one of the small pocket-sized ones. The handwriting is barely recognizable, but the evidence tag says it was written by Alice and found in her house. The handwriting was a similar type of cursive, but the lines were bolder and narrower, like their author was stricken with urgency. The day after my 15th birthday, Mr. Colton came over, asking to borrow some sugar. Mr. Colton was my parents' age, but he lived with his elderly mother. Thus, he had acquired the label of weird old man, the kind of unspoken distrust that we kids felt towards unmarried adults. His eyes roved up and down my body as he asked. I thought this was the worst thing. Before I could give him the sugar, He lunged at me, pressed a cloth over my mouth. When I woke up, I was blindfolded and bound at the wrists and ankles. I never found out where I was. I thought this was the worst thing. I think I'm underground. I don't know how long I've been here. Days at least. The room I'm in is small, no windows. I don't think it was built by professionals. The room seems to be hewn out of solid rock. There aren't the reassuring right angles of newer construction. Mostly men, but sometimes women come and go, bringing me food and taking it away, and bringing me a chamber pot and taking it away. I think they're all different, but it's hard to tell. They don't speak much, and their hoods cover their faces. Sometimes they forget to bring me food, and sometimes they forget to take the chamber pot away. I thought this was the worst thing. I think they drug me quite often. A few times I've passed out suddenly, and when I wake up, my body hurts. Sometimes I have bruises and cuts without knowing where they came from. I thought this was the worst thing. The drugging, passing out, waking up with injuries has been getting worse. This last time, I woke up with my forearms all bandaged up. Whatever's underneath hurts. It burns and itches. I'm too tired to look. I thought this was the worst thing. They feed me bread and water once a day. Once I complained that I was still hungry. My keeper suggested I eat some of the roaches. The candlelight twisted his grin into a cruel mosaic. I thought this was the worst thing. I wake up to a new pain. My insides hurt. I don't know what they've done to me this time. They treat me better now, so I try not to think about it. I get more food, candles, and a few extra blankets to sleep on. They've started posting someone outside my door at all times. The person is always humming something low and tuneless, like a Gregorian chant. I thought this was the worst thing. Time passes. My belly swells. The bandages on my arms disappear one day. 2 circles with a star inside. I might have been angry or upset about this once, but now I just don't care much. One night I am ripped out of my sleep by a ripping pain coming from below. I scream into the tiny concrete room I am in. I keep screaming and screaming until they come. I don't get any drugs this time. I feel split in half before God and everyone, more open and vulnerable than I have been this entire time. The pain is so bad, I forget how much I hate Mr. Colton and his friends as they tend to me. I beg for them to kill me. It takes hours before the baby comes out. I thought this was the worst thing. I rest and they take the baby away. If this were one of Mama's radio dramas, I would scream and cry more, rage until all of my energy is gone, demand to see my baby. But I don't want to see it. I don't want anything but my room, my school, my old life back. Today I hear footsteps approaching my prison. They tell me everything will be okay as long as I do one more thing. The scream that erupts from my throat is louder than any noise I made with the baby. They bring me a platter with a tiny, frail human figure on it, the flesh charred and blackened. They tell me to eat. This is the worst thing. So yeah, I was a little shaken after reading. Luckily, I still had 10 weeks left in the internship. I was able to get a little more information out of Frank and some of the other cops, including some who had been around when the murder occurred. One of them, Lieutenant Mueller, remembered some of the facts floating around in the aftermath of the deaths. Roughly 40 years apart in age, Alice Weiss had lived next to her eventual victim, Randall Colton, for her entire life, excluding her hospitalizations. Doing my best to act like just another college kid intrigued by cheap gore and true crime, I mentioned Frank had spoken about pentagram burns on Alice. Her psychiatric records specifically acknowledged the burns because they were the reason she was admitted to her first facility when she was a teenager, he told me. Her mother says she found the burns when the girl started wearing long sleeves, even in July. Weiss claims she had no memory of where they came from, but even as a teenager, her records also spoke to a history of depression, hallucinations, and self-harm. I brought it up again with Frank a few weeks later, specifically when I was at lunch with Frank and one of the Ashland PD's detectives. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but I do remember Frank telling me he was a Chicago cop before moving to Ashland, which is why he's the only one who doesn't get fazed by this stuff, he says. My biggest question was the connection between Randall Colton and the Dr. Colton mentioned in Alice's final letter, and Frank answered it without even realizing it.
I get why people react so strong to the Weiss thing. You live right next to people, sometimes for years, and they're never a threat to you. And then suddenly, they're the worst kind of threat. And in small towns like this, it affects people even more powerfully because you're naturally more interconnected. Hell, we even found out in the course of that investigation that Randall Colton's brother was a psychiatrist over at Marion's South State Hospital, and he treated Alice Weiss back in the 60s when she had her first breakdown.
So, that's all, right? A young girl in a small town, stricken with poor health at an early age, in a time when mental health treatment was still young, struggling for years before ending it all in a terrible fashion. Time goes on. Family homes empty and refill. Case files get put in off-site storage. People forget. The reason I dug out my copy of Alice's last words were because, as mentioned earlier, Frank sent me a short email this morning asking if I remembered about the murder house from my internship. He attached an article from the Ashland local news. 3104 Birch Lane, Randall Colton's old house, burned to the ground yesterday. The tenants were making meth there and the house exploded. 3 people died. Once the flames were out and emergency responders were able to properly investigate the scene, they found a crude sub-basement. Frank told me he'd heard from one of his old buddies that the room must have been decades old, constructed well before things like home inspections and building permits were a reality. Through a hidden door carved out of the foundation, they found a small hallway leading to a smaller room. I didn't ask Frank if they found any pentagrams on the walls. I'm sure he would have told me if they had. The way Frank put it in his email.
Hacking into the ground like that, it's a miracle the house didn't collapse 20 years ago.
Although I know he didn't mean to be ironic, I'm not sure miracle is the word I would use.